your kitchen, everything. Like, they may have bins or whatever, but everything's thrown into the bins. And here it's all neatly done, and so it's just very well organized. So you got that going for you. But I wanted to let you know that. And then the food thing that you have in the freezer, that was a great idea. And I was told that the teenagers thought of that. So good work, teenagers, creating work for the adults. Okay, so we're going to listen tonight about the Canaanites. Why would a loving God want the Canaanites destroyed? Now, whatever you hear about the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, and so on and so forth, those are all descendants of Canaan. So they're all related. And so let's go ahead and get started. I took a course, and it was through a university in Rome, and it's called Sapienza University. And the instructor's name was Lorenzo Nigro, Nigro. And he actually worked at the sites that we're going to be looking at tonight. And so he and another archaeologist before him, several have worked on this particular site that we're going to look at. So with that, we see that the place where Solomon and Manasseh did sacrifices in the Hinnom Valley in the Bible, in the Hebrew, it's called Tophet, place of fire. And the archaeologists use that term for an area we're going to look at tonight. So just to reference the Tophet, and it's in the valley of the son of Hinnom in Jerusalem. When God tells Abraham that he's going to give the land to his descendants, we see the patience of God, that the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full or complete. The Amorites were among the Canaanites. And, you know, we sometimes don't understand just what all they did and what it all entailed. And hopefully we'll get a little bit deeper insight into some of that tonight. We see that Sodom and Gomorrah's sin was very grievous unto God. And God can only tolerate, there is a limit, or there seems to be a line that God will allow us as humans to get to. But once we cross that line, it seems that he intervenes. You have the flood. You have the conquest of the land of Canaan, and because these people have become so sinful. When they are coming and they're going into getting ready to go into the promised land, they're told to, and actually this is, well, they're still wandering. You shall not let any of your seed pass through the fire unto Molech, neither shall you profane the name of thy God. I am the Lord. Molech is another name for Baal, or Baal, as some pronounce it. You have Marduk in Babylon. Molech is sort of in the Assyrian, but then the Canaanites take that god and expand on it, and they call it, and then typically in the Old Testament then is called Baal. And Baal has a counterpart, a female goddess, and her name in the Canaanite language is Ashtoreth. And same as Ishtar to the Babylonians. No one shall be found among you, and let anyone make his son, daughter pass through the fire, or uses divination, an observer of times, enchanter, or witch. Because what's wrong with that? Well, God doesn't want them to do it. Two, they're putting faith, or they're looking to something else when the answer lies with God. I have had people tell me in Bible classes that, oh, these people did not do human sacrifices. This was more like a ring of fire that they would, pass through, sort of like in a circus. They didn't think anybody could do that to another human, to do human sacrifice. In the Old Testament, in the biblical record, these people in the land are called Canaanites because they're descendants of Canaan. And in the New Testament, you don't read about Canaanites. You read about Phoenicia. And that is the Greek name for the Canaanites. The Canaanites, the Greeks called the Phoenicians. Phoenician has an element of the Greek word for red in it. And so their historians surmise that it was either they had something to do with the reddish pottery maybe that they took around, or it might have had something to do with the cedars because they owned the cedars of Lebanon. And they took it all over the Mediterranean. And some think it could be something to do with their skin color. So they had the best navy on the Mediterranean. And you may be surprised when you find out who are Canaanites and Phoenicians. So Tyre, Sidon, we know are Canaanite, and they go back to Isaac. Remember, Esau married women from Tyre and Sidon for two of his wives. Carthage, ancient Carthage, is Canaanite. Now, they operated as city-states, but they had the same culture. The things we're going to look at tonight, you can go to the ancient Carthage, you can look it up online, and you're going to see this exact same plan that we're going to be looking at tonight. Tarsus, they're not sure. That's really probably not been discovered to this point, but it was at the far end of the Mediterranean. It was Timbuktu in the ancient world. That's where Jonah was headed. He's going to the farthest place away that he could go. And then the Italians call it Moizza with a Z sounding, or Moita. And that is right there off the tip of Sicily. And we're going to zoom in on that. But they had these settlements along the coast, and there are probably more that have yet to be found. But these ships and these Canaanites took the cedars of Lebanon everywhere. The king of Assyria put on his palace walls, when he ordered some timber, cedar of Lebanon, he was so impressed, he showed it, them bringing the logs down the river to be built. The Canaanites typically were not warrior peoples until you get to Hannibal. But they had a great navy, but they were merchants. And so whoever was in charge, they pretty much worked with whoever, was willing to pay. And Tyre was pretty secure because it was an island out in the Mediterranean. So as I mentioned, we see that he went down to Joppa. So Joppa early on is a Canaanite area where they shipped from, and he was going to Tarsus. So Moita is what we're going to look at tonight, and we're going to look at that little dot, and as we zoom in, there's a little island, and it is protected on almost all sides. So it was a safe harbor, and this is what the island looks like. So there is, at the end here, what's called the CoC, and it's a circular thing, and it has a rectangular pond-looking thing there in the center. We'll talk about that. The museum's here today, and then there's another area up here within the city walls where all of this was. At first, they thought this was a harbor, and then they began, as they dug it out, they thought, no, this isn't a harbor, it's something else. This is a model of the circular wall and then the reflective pond, we're going to call it. And it had one entrance, and along the inside wall, there must have been booths for merchants. This is a place, there was a temple to Baal and then a shrine to Astarte, Ashtoreth. And there is an image of Baal right in the very center. Now, and you can see that's my Baal right there that I have. It's a real one. Anyway, as they began to excavate, first of all, here at the gate, they find black and white stones, onyx, and then this white stone they're smoothed out. And it seems that black was associated with Baal and white was associated with Ashtoreth. So I don't know if that was that they don't know if they put those in to enter or if it was like some type of offering. They don't know why it was there, but they find it. And along the walls, as they began to excavate, they found a human tooth, an adult human tooth. And then they found another adult human tooth. And then they could tell where the next one would be because they were all exactly spaced apart, exactly right. And there was a human tooth all the way around. So they don't know why they're there, but where they expected to find a human tooth, they found the pelvis of a 9-year-old girl, approximately 9-year-old girl. And they don't know what the reason was, but it's there. Now, if you look here, Baal is not looking north to south. He's tilted looking 6 degrees this direction. The archaeologists couldn't quite figure out why it was not looking directly south. And so then they started working with the astronomers across the hall. Well, they weren't literally across the hall, but they worked with the astronomers. The astronomers looked at it right away. And there's more of this going on today because archaeologists haven't been trained in all of the patterns of the stars. And when an astronomer looks at it, they say, oh, and they see all these things. So they're starting to work much closer together. When you go up into Turkey, Anatolia, where what's called the Hittites, when you get the astronomers involved, there's a calendar. And it looks just like a bunch of gods etched into the walls, or into the walls of this cavern, not cavern, a valley. And it actually is a calendar, and the sun would hit it at a certain time, so you knew what month it was. So he's looking at the winter solstice, and he's associated with the winter solstice, and then Ashtoreth is associated with the summer solstice. And he's in a different pose than you typically find Baal. He has his arm across his chest. And by the by, I read a bulletin article, and there was a preacher who wrote a great article about Baal, except he went online, and if you go online there for a while, and you only see an illustration, they say Baal was a bull-headed figure, and he's not. Because we've got little Baals all around, and the Canaanite Baal did not have horns. It was not a cow. So they thought that the calf that was set up in Israel was an association with the Baal, but it's not. The Canaanite Baal has a pointed head or a conical hat upon his head, and typically he has a mallet in his hand to strike the clouds and a lightning bolt. And in this case, he's got his arms crossed, so they don't really know what that means, but there it is. So they found the torso on the island buried, and so this stood about 6 foot tall. And in the center of the reflecting pool, they found a base with the imprint of the foot that had been broken off. And then this is at the shrine of Baal on the other part of the island, and he's got that same pose, and don't really know why it's that way, but on this island, it's the only place they find the Baal image like that. This is a 16-foot carving. It's in Paris at the Louvre, and it was carved by the king, which is pictured here, or he had it carved. And so you see Baal, and this is a lightning bolt. It looks like a plant. And then you see the mallet that goes above, and then he a lot of times has these curls coming off his hair. And so he is a storm god. Baal is never, well, he's not always like the chief god in like a culture, but he's like right up there. He's a very important god in all the cultures. He's called by different names. And you see this one little figure, and sometimes he's on little stilts, I guess, to help him reach the clouds. And then here's another figure here, and then some of them, he's got big wavy ears. Baal, Poseidon. Poseidon in the Greek, he is on the Titan side of the gods and the Titans, and then he goes over into the Olympus gods. So Poseidon goes over. There is a blurred line association there with the Noah figure. Okay. Zeus, known by the Greeks, lightning bolt. Jupiter to the Romans. Thor to the Norse. So he's in business and making movies today. Gideon, and this is not a good representation of an Ashtoreth, but that's just an illustration. Gideon cut down the grove to Ashtoreth. Okay, and Ashtoreth is the consort to Baal. Astarte, Ashtoreth, Ishtar to the Babylonians, Artemis to the Greeks, and Iana to the Sumerians, and Diana to the Latin. All of those names mean the same. They mean star. It's where the word Easter comes from. In the worship of Ashtoreth, she was a goddess of war and fertility. And so lilies, eggs, bunnies, anything that represents fertility is associated with that. Easter. And that's in the King James Bible because they already had that holiday when they wrote it, but it should have been Passover. So, oh, and you know her today too. And she's making movies. She made TV shows. So she was a hero or heroine, and DC, they're wherever you're at. Here, they thought it was a harbor at first, and then they decided no. Oh, I forgot to tell you about the reflective pond. When they went back and they were talking to the well, I should have just told you about it. I think I broke it. Can you go back one for me? Is it stuck? Go backwards. 14. Go to slide 14. 13. There we go. The other thing that the astronomers were able to figure out, and they find this at Byblos, which is beside Tyre and Sidon. It's Canaanite. And then they have one at Carthage. You know what that is? It's an ancient telescope. They could measure the movement of the planets and the stars at night, and they could mark the edges. And by measuring it, they could track the patterns of the stars and see all of these things. The zodiac that exists today was invented not long after the flood by the Sumerians. There's a thing called a Sumerian star chart, and all of the names are already there. Leo the lion, all of these characters that they named the stars, and they began to worship that. You go to Romans chapter 1, and God gave them over to their vile lust of their own minds, and they began to worship the creation rather than the creator. And so you see that. So and if they're sailors, what do sailors typically do to navigate? They watch the stars. So you could see how that got into their society and all of this. But it became something more, and they began to worship it. And that's just like our society today. It doesn't have to be an image of a god. You can worship anything that's earthly. And so we have to be careful that we don't, get caught into that same trap. So now we want to go up to this area, which is called the Tophet. They named it the Tophet. It's interesting. It's inside the city walls. In the ancient world, death and burials always happened on the outside of the city walls. They didn't want the dead inside the city walls. So in this particular area here, you've got a precinct, and then you have a shrine to Baal. And working backwards, you have this area here. It's an altar or something else we'll talk about in a minute. They have a well, and actually they found 2 wells there, and both of them had been plugged up, and they were a square as opposed to being a circle. So the entrance here, you would come around, and there would be this sacred well. We don't know what they did there. They come up, and there's an offering of some sort. You go up here, and then there's a shrine to Baal. And then down here are these votive deposits, and we're going to look at those in a moment. And then over here is called the Field of Urns. And they know that there's some type of pattern the way these went in, but they haven't figured out why at this point. Same thing you find at Carthage. You find it at Byblos. I think Sidon has it, or it's been pretty well destroyed at Sidon. So so in this area, they've decided that maybe they should be looking for an oven and not an altar because of how fine the ashes are. So in my video, I recreated this and talk about it there. And here is the well, one of the wells that they found. And whoever destroyed the site, they plugged up the well, they don't want it there. And we don't know who did it. And they don't know exactly what date it was. But whoever got rid of it, they didn't want it there. And so it seems that it was all buried. The Field of Urns has all of these, this type of urn in it, and the dirt has either been brought in or it's refined, and it's still a softer dirt than the area around it. And so you see, again, the same thing at Carthage and these other sites. They didn't want to break open the urns, but there were a few that were busted, and so they knew what was in them. But now they've been using this new type of radar penetration, so they can see what's inside there. But they pretty much know what's inside there. And as we see if you can go forward for me. slide 23, if you can go. There we go. So here's one that was broken. And these are ashes of children 18 months to 3 years of age that are in the field of urns. And how do they know that? Because they find milk teeth that did not burn. But the ashes are so refined, that's why they're thinking that maybe there's an oven involved. And that's what the Canaanites were doing. And we don't know the exact reasons. There's some markings we'll see here in a bit. These are some of the small bones and things that have been found there. At Gezer, which is inland and it's west of Judah, but at Gezer in the early 1900s, late 1800s going into the early 1900s, there were some excavations there. And they say that the archaeologists that dug the place didn't keep the best records, but they have a similar kind of a thing, but they have these big pillars that almost looks like Stonehenge, but it's in a row. But beneath the pillars, they have buried the bones, and they're children from like 8 to their early teens. And many of them have been sawn in half, and they can see the marks on the vertebrae on the backs. And so God wanted all these people gone. And he wanted all of the men, he wanted all the women, he wanted all the children gone. Now, people say, well, that just seems so cruel. But when David and Bathsheba sinned and they had a child, and then David prayed to God all that time, and the child died, and David got up to eat, and the servant said, well, we thought you'd be upset. And he said, when the child was alive, God might have changed his mind, to paraphrase that. But now the child is dead, and he says, the child cannot return to me, but I can go to the child. Now, he doesn't say that about Absalom, when Absalom tries to usurp the kingdom from him. And when Absalom dies, he says, oh, Absalom, Absalom, my son Absalom, because he knew that Absalom had sinned. So anyway, you've got this, and so they didn't find any older kids other than the 9-year-old so far here at this site. Then there is this place that they have these that are within the confines of that. You see the Baal figure there in his shrine at this place. And then there are markings on most or some of these. And they'll say something along the line, the gift to Lord, Baal means Lord, the gift to Baal, and the names of the parents who dedicated the gift. Nothing about the name of a child. Now, whether these people were sailors and they were that superstitious, but the Canaanites and the Canaanites' descendants, they were practicing these things. And it was an abomination to God. Now, we talked about the votive pit. A lot of ancient temples have votive pits, and what they are, at most of the other temples, they'll find these votive pits. A lot of times they'll be human figures, and they'll be broken in some fashion. And in the ancient world, if the doctor could not cure you, you would go to your god's temple, and you would have a potter make an image of yourself, and it would just be something, somewhat simple. And we're not really sure why they're broken in certain ways, but perhaps, like if you were having problems with an arm or a different part of your body, they would, in some form or fashion, break that and then put it in the votive pit and then do the offering. But in this case, all of these votives are of the head of Baal and the head of Ashtoreth, and they all have holes in these heads, and so they were meant to be hung on something. I took a course from the University of Athens, and it was on olives and olive trees in the ancient world. And most ancient cultures, I mean, all ancient cultures, the olive tree was sacred. And it was a symbol of peace, health, and in Athens, they had an olive tree that was really old when they built the area up there at the Parthenon. And if you did, they said that Athena gave the Greeks the olive tree. And if you did anything to that sacred olive tree, you could get, the penalty could be death. So if you like hurt the tree in any way. However, most all ancient temples had some type of grove around them of olives. So they were considered sacred. Now, whether or not they had that here, they don't know. But these figures hung from something, because as you look here, they have the holes. Now this one's been broken, but they have the hole to be hung. That's Baal, and then there's Ashtoreth. And so one thought that came to mind, you think of Christmas ornaments, something like that on the trees. So you see them excavating here and all of these things. We see that the northern 10 tribes, when Ahab and Jezebel were king, that Elijah gets all of the prophets of Baal up to Mount Carmel. And there's 450 for Baal and 400 that ate at Jezebel's table. Jezebel's Canaanite. She's from Tyre. And so he says, how long will you vacillate between two opinions? And nobody answers. And you know the story there. If you don't, you can go look it up tonight. But the prophets of Baal tried to get Baal to light the fire on his own for their sacrifice, and they can't. And they cut themselves and everything. And then Elisha prays after that one is soaked 7 times, the water's running everywhere, and the fire comes down and it consumes the offering, the altar, all the rocks and everything, and there's no water left on the ground. In 2 Kings 3, and remember the Misha Steles downstairs that parallels that, we see that the king of Moab offers on the wall his son that would have reigned in his place, and it's his oldest son. And why he did that, they were defeated. They couldn't break out. They're inside the walls of the city, and it seems like this might be something of a last resort. Why does he do this? Well, we don't really know. There could be a possibility, though. When you look at the last part of the verse, there was great indignation, not against the king of Moab. It was against Israel. Because Jehoram is the son of Ahab. And so maybe in some form or fashion, it was done for his behalf. But anyway, Judah leaves. Everyone goes back to their own land. And then I think the king of Moab he was no longer under tribute to Jehoram, and they just let it go. And then he rebuilt everything, and that's why he built the Misha Stele. Manasseh, king of Judah, when he was 12 years old when he began to reign. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. He knew. Yeah, we talk about age of accountability, but Manasseh was more educated than many of the other kids, perhaps, being part of the royal family. But he would have known the difference between right and wrong. And that what he did, it was evil. He reared up altars for Baal and made a grove. That's for Ashtoreth. He did as Ahab. He worshiped the host of heaven. See the reflective pond? He worshiped the host of heaven. I'm not saying they had one. Built altars, graven images. He made his son pass through the fire. He wrought much wickedness. Manasseh shed innocent blood very much till he had filled Jerusalem from one end to the other. What did God tell them when they came into the promised land? About blood. You don't pollute the land with blood. Now they were to drive out all of those Canaanites and they were to kill them, but they were not to kill their own. And Jerusalem was filled one end to the other with innocent blood. The only innocents are those that cannot distinguish between right and wrong. Those are children before they have the ability to distinguish that. Manasseh seduced them to do more evil than the nations whom the Lord destroyed before the children of Israel. Now, Manasseh's later, we're going to see he will repent, but because of the sin that he did, God was still, he could not let this go. Josiah, his son, turns to God with all of his heart. Notwithstanding, the Lord turned not from his fierceness and his great wrath, whereas his anger was kindled against Judah because of the provocations of Manasseh. You know, people sometimes we say, well, why did that terrible thing happen? Well, sin is in the world. It's going to affect even righteous people sometimes. And we just have to learn and pray that God will protect us, but sometimes it might be part of God's plans that we are in the fray. And you can't blame God for that. I will remove Judah also out of my sight. You know, were there any righteous that went into captivity into Babylon? First chapter, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. United States. This is how many abortions between 1973 and 2014. Nearly 60 million. You know, in the Civil War, at the Battle of Shiloh, the people that were killed on both sides, the amount of dead, and they were just horrified. And I think, what was it, some maybe 20,000 people died, and the population was just horrified at the slaughter that was going on in the Civil War. And one historian said, well, the tactics had not caught up with the weapons. And that's why you have such a high number. But these are abortions. People are choosing this. The population of the United States in the Civil War was 60 million. That's like a whole nation back then. And you have to wonder, is there a point that God will say, that's enough? Because he did it for the flood, he did it for Sodom and Gomorrah, he did it with the Canaanites. Will he do it today? If the wickedness gets so bad. You know, you look at history and you say, well, why did that happen to all those people? I don't know. But I do know that God is in control. Worldwide, since 1980, almost 1.5 billion people aborted before. You know, China has a policy, or had a policy. I think we think they've been lying about their population numbers. And so they were afraid they would have too many mouths to feed, and they didn't want to import grain. So when I was working in China, there was a factory manager, and I flew over a slow boat in China from Shanghai to Ningbo, and it was 13 hours, and it was filthy to meet this guy. And I get there, and he wasn't there. And so I said, what happened? And they said, well, his wife is having a second child. And I said, well, what happens in that situation? And they said, well, if they catch her, they'll force her to have an abortion. But they want to have the child. And I said, well, what happens then? And he said, well, he sent his wife out into the countryside to live with far distant relatives, and they do a shell game with her until she has the baby. And I said, well, then what happens? And then he said he just pays a tax for extra student at school. But they don't do anything once the child is born. But to think that people think that life in the womb is not life. And it's funny that so many want to go to other planets to seek out life when here they murder it. It's kind of unusual. But that's my presentation. And I think that's something to think about. That's kind of sobering when I looked at that. And when you look at the wickedness of the Canaanites and what they did, and they weren't the only peoples that did terrible things, but they were the ones that God was going to give their land to his people. And he wanted them out. He didn't want his people doing that. And we got to remember that in the church. We got to be careful that we don't get sucked into doing what the world is doing. And we are a peculiar people. The world needs to see that. They need to see that we are different. And one of the reasons that the Christians were persecuted after Rome burnt, and according to Tacitus, the historian, and Philo, I think, may have written something about it, Nero burnt Christians in his garden and blamed the fires on the Christians. And I think it was Philo. And he said that people thought that was a little harsh. And he blamed the Christians for being antisocial. They didn't mingle in. In other words, Christians, when they became Christians, they stopped going to the markets to buy offerings to the idols. Ancient sacrifice in the ancient world among the pagan countries, nations, that was an economy. And when you see Pliny's letter, Pliny the Younger's letter to Trajan, once he's already started putting some Christians to death, he says already the temples have been starting to get sacrifices again and the marketplaces are flourishing. We should be able to make a difference in society that we don't do the same things that the people of the world do, and it should be noticeable. And I think we should be conscious about that we should really try that we are different. I'll turn off the mic and then if I'm done. So
with all the hurricanes, fires, floods, I mean, if you open your eyes and see what's going on in America, and in Illinois, the soybeans aren't getting pollinated like they're supposed to. I read an article the other day that said there may be a food shortage even in this country because of all this. So I think God has already begun to say, okay.
There was there was the 2008 financial crisis, and then there was before that there was 9/11. And there was something that stuck with me. There was a headline in one of the papers, and it was talking about the little boys that were on the flight that went into the Pentagon, and it said, even God cannot stop this. No, that's not true. Sin is around us. It's going to affect us. But, it seems like there's some warning shots over the bow. Jesus said there's always going to be earthquakes, there's always going to be these catastrophes around, but as a nation, it seems like there's some warning shots over the bow, and for a brief time, you'll see an upswing in church attendance, but then right away, seems like there's a bigger slide. So just pray really hard. That's what we can do, and you've got something coming up. Prayer over Iowa. Yeah, so I mean, things like that. I mean, we have to have faith, and I think there's when you have all these years where since the 1950s when they went to the Education Act under Eisenhower, and then they decided, well, we're going to do this and this and this because we're getting behind the Russians. And they said, well, what are we going to teach in science as far as how everything got here? And what did the Russians do? They teach evolution, so that's what they do. Certain states fought back, Texas and some of the states. I didn't have evolution growing up in the state of Texas. It didn't hit my plate. They didn't talk about creation. They just kind of avoided it. But anyway, when you look at, that's been drilled into the kids' minds. And then they come home from school, and if we're not reinforcing Christian values, and they're not getting good Bible classes, but they're getting all this at school, it's going to have some effect on them. And they see all their peers believing that. And let's just pray that, some perhaps legislation might help or whatever. But Matt Vega is a professor of law at Freed-Hardeman University, and he did a lecture, and he said, since the church began having a period of 250 years of freedom of worship is unusual, without persecution. And, he's looking at things that are happening, at the Supreme Court. Looks like some things are getting a little better in the last couple of years, but we always have to be prepared and pray, and that's the strongest tool that we have. So, okay, anything else? Did you want me to keep talking 10 more minutes? Good night.